Welcome to Breaking with Tradition, a new Catalyst podcast where we follow in the footsteps of our founder, Felice Schwartz, and sit down with change-making leaders and professionals accelerating diversity, equity, and inclusion in today's global workplace.
Founded in 1962, Catalyst drives change with unparalleled thought leadership, actionable solutions, and a galvanized community of multinational corporations to accelerate and advance women into leadership. Because progress for women is progress for everyone. We're your hosts. My name is Lucy Cullen.
I'm Victoria Coquetz.
And I'm Erin Resendiz. And we're three Catalystas that live in different regions around the globe. We're united by one goal: to create workplaces where anyone can thrive, regardless of their identity. We are really excited to be kicking off a podcast for Catalyst that is called Breaking with Tradition. And we could think of no one better to be part of this discussion with us than you, Ruchika. You are continuously breaking with tradition in your work as a diversity, equity, and inclusion expert, an author, and a leader who helps organizations and individuals do more and do better around DEI. So just really thrilled to spend some time with you today and talk about the state of play for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Thanks again.
Thank you, Erin. This means so much. Thank you.
And so, Ruchika, tell us a bit about your work and what you bring to your own practice and how you work with clients around diversity, equity, and inclusion before we dive into today's discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I think of the work that I do, or my approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion, sort of as multifaceted. So much of it is driven by various identities I have and hold, throughout my life. So I am a woman of color. I was born outside the United States, so I'm an immigrant, and I've actually been an immigrant in a variety of different countries. I am a mother, and I'm also just someone who has sort of worked in different industries. I was a business journalist for many years. I worked in the tech industry, which gave me, actually, I would say the tech industry gave me a very unique insight into what it looks like to work within an industry that's very innovative, very cutting edge on the one end, of course, has a huge amount of influence, and on the other, unfortunately, stuck in many ways because of not being able to, or at least when I was in the industry about a decade ago, really not being able to address and confront many of the long-held biases that were very much foundational to the way that the technology industry was set up. So for me, I would say these identities and the various sort of experiences I've had have been very, very key to dictating the work that I do in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I've been really lucky to be able to write about both some of the experiences and, more than anything, the data and some of what I've seen around what the experience is like for women. I like to center the experience of women of color in the workplace, especially because I don't think it's talked about nearly enough. It's actually very heartening to see the wonderful work that Catalyst has been doing around this, because I remember when I started out writing about this, even in journalism, it was really hard to get some of the data to show that, hey, this is the experience that people are actually having. I loved reading about and writing about for Harvard Business Review about the experience of women of color facing colorism in the workplace, or skin tone bias, which was research from Catalyst. And it was something I had observed and seen my whole life, especially growing up in Asia, and never quite had the words to communicate, like, how does it really impact the lives of women? And yet it was impacting the lives of literally every single woman I had interacted with my entire life, like right from my grandmother, and my ancestors, to, the women who I was graduating alongside at university, to the women who I was, interviewing with for jobs. I mean, it was so pervasive and so it really brings me a lot of joy that we are working on these really hard issues together. I like to think about my work sort of marrying storytelling, uncovering untold stories to really create the type of workplace that works for all. And really create the sort of environment where people feel excited to bring their full potential to the workplace every day.
Ruchika, hearing you talk about the sort of connective tissue between what you're doing and what Catalyst is doing, it's so heartening. And I think your lived experience should not need to be backed up with data, but since this is the reality that we live in, the fact that Catalyst can bring to bear some of that data that we know from women's lived experiences is true. I think it just means so much to be able to marry those two things and have both the personal storytelling and the sort of receipts of the research to uncover what is happening in workplaces around the world, particularly for women. So excited to dive in and hear more from you about kind of where we are in 2024 in the state of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So if we're just to read the headlines and to look around, it could feel like it's a lot of doom and gloom. There are, challenges to the very idea of diversity, equity, inclusion programming coming at us from several directions. But, we at Catalyst have been at this for over 60 years as an organization and have seen the, kind of ebbs and flows and hopefully have been able to meet the moments as they come up. And so I would just pose the question to you. What is your take on the state of diversity, equity, and inclusion as a practice as we sit here in 2024?
Yeah, I don't want to make light of some of the attacks that we're seeing. I mean, it is concerning. There is no doubt about that. And we are seeing it at various different levels, whether it's education, whether it's the workplace, whether it's academia. So I don't want to make light of it. I want to say that many of these attacks are very targeted and they're very real, and there is an impact. I mean, we are feeling the impact without a doubt. At the same time, I will say I am someone who is cautiously optimistic. I haven't quite been in this work for 60 years, but I have certainly spent over 2 decades in this work, and many more in my lived experience. I shall not name my age yet, but what I will say is what gives me sort of that hope and that comfort as we see headlines like DEI shouldn't exist, or reverse discrimination. What I will say, what a couple of things. Firstly, I'd say the most important part of this is that a lot of these attacks are not new. They're not using, they might be using new language. There might be different packaging around it. But this field, and just thinking about the fact that 10 years ago, when I was in the technology industry, at that time, even using the words diversity, equity, and inclusion were basically completely new. Diversity people sort of understood at a high level, but there wasn't no leaders I was working with were really using these words in their daily lexicon, right? Like it wouldn't even come up in conversations that were being had. I think of especially the understanding of what equity means and those historical barriers that have left so many people out of the workplace, out of leadership, out of being able to bring their full potential to the workplace and society. That word and that concept was completely not understood. I remember the first time I read about the word microaggressions was, decades ago. And of course, it has a long history of the academic sort of use of microaggressions, coined by Dr. Chester Pierce. But nobody I knew and I was working alongside really understood it or would even use this terminology. And I actually think now we've come to a place where I think it's so widely understood, we can actually update it to say like, hey, microaggressions are actually not that micro. They actually have a very macro impact on people, on their lives, on their careers. So I think we've actually reached a stage where we can say, like, microaggressions, we all understand what that means largely. And now let's talk about, actually, it's not micro, it's, these exclusionary behaviors have a big impact. So I feel like we have reached a place where those people who are really in it, who are really doing this work, we're going to band together much more. There'll be a lot more solidarity than I think we've ever seen before. And coming together, I think, is what's going to really help us get through this wave of, this fresh wave of sort of attacks and that sort of question mark of what happens. Will I get left behind? Some part of this, I think, is also the zero-sum thinking that I think a lot of people and leaders and organizations sometimes operate with, right? Like this idea of winner takes all, like either you're winning because I'm losing or I'm winning because you're losing. And I think so much of doing this work really well requires us to recognize that a rising tide really lifts all boats, which, again, I don't have to explain this to you, but it really does help all of us kind of envision and create that very innovative future for all.
Yes. I'm, of course, nodding along because, I think it's so spot on that, the language changes, the language evolves, and that's just, kind of the nature of the work. But what doesn't change is what we're ultimately trying to accomplish. Yeah. The language is the tactic, to help us get there. But what we're ultimately trying to accomplish is workplaces that work for women because they work for everyone. Like that, mm-hmm. That's our whole mandate at Catalyst. And it, it certainly sounds like that's true in your work too, where if the workplace is a place where women feel like they can show up authentically, where they're going to experience inclusion, whatever that means to them, however it feels for them, mm-hmm. And be able to succeed on their terms, whatever that means to them, then that's good for everybody. It's good for every workplace, right? So I likewise take, some heart in knowing that there are people who are not backing down from this core belief that we can create equitable, inclusive workplaces, regardless of the swirl externally around us and whatever the, the sort of pushback of the moment may be. At its core, this work is about our shared humanity and the ability to be, fully seen, heard, cared for at work, right? So it's almost like the pushback and the challenges they're very real. They're going to take different shape, and we need to be able to sort of adapt to them. I wonder, if you had to give some advice to folks who are likewise in this space and feeling maybe, not quite as buoyant in this moment, or needing some reminders about how to shore themselves up, what might you be telling your clients or your peers in the space in this moment?
Yeah, I love this question. And I will say one thing that I feel, again, optimistic about, cautiously optimistic, I will say, is I'm seeing so many more people in the last 6 to 8 years really realize that even if they have had privilege, even if they've never had to think about, for example, the example I use often because it's so personal to me when when I'm speaking or when I'm just having this conversation, even with clients, is at the end of this meeting, if it's winter, I have to look out the window and I have to make sure that it's not dark. And if it is, I need to have a strategy for how I'm going to leave this place safely that my male identifying counterparts don't have to have, right? And that switch is really easy to understand, right? Because it's it's the recognition of like this additional calculation that people who have been historically underestimated have to do every single day. What do I wear? How do I do my hair? Like, will it be accepted? How much do I have to change myself? And then of course the professional and personal ramifications that come with being historically underestimated and having to sort of go out of your way. And so what I started realizing is, again, over the last 6 to 8 years, I've noticed a lot more people who didn't ever have to think about this, like that was never on their radar, suddenly start to realize it's their fight too, right? Like that their privilege isn't going to necessarily render them or the people they love immune from some of these attacks. And I think what makes me really hopeful is seeing so many more clients I work with, people I work with, friends I'm now in contact with, who say, like, I identify as a cis straight white man. Like I could be right at the top of, this privilege hierarchy. And I recognize, like, this fight is not yours to fight alone. Like I really need to be involved in this. I am going to do the work. I am going to really try and show up the way I need to. And beyond just, I'm going to, be part of a book club, or I'm going to read this one book and now I'm suddenly caught up, but really through very tactical action, action like amplification, a strategy used in the Obama administration. I write about it in the book, where, male people who identify as male, who have some level of privilege and influence in the room they're part of, will actually go out of their way to re-up what the woman or the person of color was saying in the room, to make sure that they get credit and they get a chance to sort of share their ideas, especially if they're being interrupted, which we know women and people of color are so much more likely to be interrupted in a meeting than our white male counterparts. And I think that's been really heartening for me. I'm starting to see a lot more people say, I may be a lawyer, or I may be an accountant, or I'm a doctor. Like DEI isn't part of my core remit, right? Like I'm not a chief inclusion officer, but I understand how being mindful of the way that I'm pronouncing people's names, or making sure that I'm getting pronouns correct, or really doing an audit of who do I take on as my clients, or how do I talk to different patients differently. These sorts of things, that sort of recognition can really have huge change. And I think those were conversations I certainly wasn't having even, a few years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like it can feel sometimes like progress is slow, and the numbers back that up, right? In terms of diverse representation in boardrooms and C-suites, we know that to be true. And also, if you think about, to your point, in 6 to 8 years, this is a real kind of seismic shift in people's understanding of not only what diversity means, what inclusion means, but what their role is in it, and that it is, it's everyone's issue. It's everyone's issue. So that is heartening, right? That we've made that much movement with individuals in a short amount of time. We think so often at Catalyst, because it's really built into our mission, about systems change. So we know a movement is people moving. So there's an individual component to that, of course, because organizations are made up of individual people who, if they can understand themselves better, their own biases better, and then make change to their behavior, then we'll see systemic change. But we're really looking at how do we support organizations and leaders create system-wide change that then will lead to, individual outcomes. And your piece about imposter syndrome in the Harvard Business Review, just it made me think so much about what is coming from the outside and what is actually coming from inside us that maybe we have internalized. So it's very, very much we think of imposter syndrome as this individual challenge, but you so clearly laid out for us that no, it's actually a systemic issue that we as women in particular don't need to take on. So I just would love to hear you talk about that a bit, and how you see the potential for this systems level change to maybe even make things like imposter syndrome a thing of the past, or moot, because women won't look internally at those types of things. So let's unpack that a bit.
Yeah, I love this question. And I think one of the most important things about imposter syndrome is, for me, it's a term that obviously is very loaded. I feel like I was seeing it everywhere, even in the height of the early pandemic. Like, getting into lockdown, we're trying to wonder what our future and our lives and our safety will look like. And people are still sending me, webinars and detail and emails about how to overcome my imposter syndrome. So it felt very like a huge disconnect, like true cognitive dissonance. At the same time, I think it's less about like the actual terminology, whether it's imposter syndrome, whether it's like women's lack of confidence, whether it's like women sabotaging themselves. And a lot of this narrative that was unfortunately popularized in especially white feminism and especially in corporate white feminism, which focused on like women as individuals falling short, like women don't negotiate or women don't speak up enough. They don't raise their hands for the big projects. Women are really, caught up in parenthood and caregiving, and they don't ask for raises enough, and all of this sort of shame and blame, which I think very much has done us a disservice, because I've met a lot of women who have said, I have thought about it myself, and even subscribe to this idea of like, oh, I should just be grateful that I had this opportunity at all. Like, I shouldn't be asking for anything more than just what's in front of me. I should just be glad it happened. And I think we've done a huge disservice by not looking at it, largely as a systemic issue. And one of the things that I started noticing, especially in corporations, but even in some of the consulting work I've done, is how much the men around me were getting that affirmation. When they started their careers, they might have been a little like, oh, like I'm nervous, or I'm not confident, I'm not going to negotiate my first salary, for example. Like, I think of, male peers or male friends in my life. But as they're in the workforce longer, they get affirmed, right? They get told you're doing great work, right? We look at some of the feedback men get versus women. So a lot of times men get feedback that is really actionable. So even if it's like, you're not getting a raise this year, if you do X, Y, Z, you will get the raise next year. And for women, that's very much not the case, unfortunately. So what I started seeing is men around me were getting affirmed, right? Men around me were getting opportunities to actually see themselves in leadership, people who looked like them. I started seeing the data that showed that, women, that 3/4 of sponsors choose proteges of the same race and gender as them. So if you're getting sponsored for those big opportunities, most of the time you were a white man getting sponsored for those big opportunities. So once you start to unpack sort of the systemic issues at play, it becomes really hard to keep saying or keep believing that it is an internal issue that you are struggling with. And I think that was for me why Jodi Ann Burey and I really wanted to question this narrative of like, it's an individual issue. It's only if women did this, they would be able to get ahead. And I think, again, the data is so conflicting. I have literally talked to women, and I'm sure you can think of examples. I can certainly think of examples where often in the same instance, I would be called too confident or bossy or aggressive and not confident enough. Like, literally, that's piece of conflicting feedback. It really ties into a lot of the research we've seen in academia around gender, around, the narrow tightrope and being respected versus being liked. I mean, how do you win, right? How do you win? Until you stop taking it on as an internal burden, you cannot win. And that is why, for me, I always encourage leaders, and especially leaders who have come from historically underestimated communities, we need to widen the table. We need to show different styles of leadership. We need to show that someone who pounds their fists, especially a woman who pounds her fists, or is just, her personality is such that her leadership style is to be, strong, commanding, domineering, etc., is just as acceptable as someone who identifies as an introvert, who's really quiet, who leads sort of in a different way. And I think we still have a long way to go to see so many more different leadership styles, which will allow more of us to feel like we can show up as our authentic selves in the workplace.
Yes, that you know, it's that consistent and continual, what else should I be doing? What do I need to change, shift, that I think, so many of the women in my life, I hear them say that even, and it's interesting, even when we know better, we're still not immune to it. I noticed that's still happening a lot with people who know this isn't actually about me. This is societal. I'm absorbing this, but then we take that on and go, well, I still, how do I expel that? And then we own the shame around, I'm not able to expel that, so there must be something wrong with me, right? That could be a whole other conversation. But I wondered, what do you think this shift in, externalizing this, like, what does that mean for the future of work?
That is such a good question. And I am someone who really tries to do away with the sort of blame and shame approach to things. And I, of course, fall prey to a lot of the ways that I have been conditioned, even when I know better. And I think so much of that is being human. It's that awareness that, hey, like this, I was conditioned this way. I'm falling prey to these biases that I was conditioned with, or these ideas. I mean, especially when I talk about gender inequity, again, I don't have to tell you this, but I always share that gender inequity isn't necessarily men doing inequity to women. A lot of times the systemic approach, I mean, some of the most challenging and concerning examples of gender bias I've seen in the workplace has been from women upholding very patriarchal, very gender biased norms against other women. So I think we need to be careful when like sometimes the narrative, and unfortunately I think some of the backlash is the idea of like we're separating people out into groups, we're creating more divisions rather than understanding that a systemic biases impact everyone regardless of their identity. So I think there's some part of it, which is that. I think the other part for me, when I think of sort of the future of work, is it's so clear to me that when you're able to create cultures of belonging, when you are able to create a workplace where people feel like they can truly be who they are, and this is not me saying like every workplace has to be like a family where everyone overshares and there's like all this. I mean, that is literally the opposite of what I'm trying to share. But it's where someone who, if they've always, I've talked to women who have removed, for example, the hijab before they go to the workplace, before they go to their office, and then come back and put it back on. I'm talking about examples like that where truly people have felt, and so many of us, right? I've met people, I remember there's this wonderful woman I met, and as a thank you gift, I gave her a water bottle with her name. I don't share her name because it is, like mine, not very common. And I gave her a water bottle with her name on it. And she wrote me a note and she said, I'm in my 50s and I have never had an article of anything with my full real name on it. I've always shortened it. For decades in the workplace, people knew me as this other name because I just didn't, I grew up being teased about it. And I kind of shared that I made this decision that I would never go by my full name. And it just meant so much to receive that message. And she was like, from now on, I will go as, I've been trying really hard to reclaim my full name outside my home. And I think these examples of people being able to really be their full authentic selves is the type of future of work that I really want us to see. Because what starts happening, and again, in the book and the work I've done, again, it gives permission not only to women of color or women or people who are LGBTQ, but truly people at the quote unquote top of the hierarchy, which, again, the research is also clear on the fact that unfortunately, toxic masculinity, patriarchy, racism doesn't just impact the people who have been disenfranchised by it, but also people who are supposedly supposed to benefit from this. Unfortunately, it harms everyone. And so to hear from, white men who say to me, hey, I identify as an introvert. I don't like speaking up in meetings and, being so commanding and domineering. It's expected of the workplace that I work at. And since we've sort of been working on inclusion much more thoughtfully and intentionally, I feel like I can bring my more quiet, more introverted self to meetings and to my leadership style. So again, this idea of like truly everyone benefits if we create an environment where people don't feel like they have to change themselves to succeed there, that's the future of work that I envision.
Oh, I hope we together can manifest that, and I see your work. Your work is doing it. I mean, for sure that we often say at Catalyst that this work is about being human next to each other. It's as simple and as complicated as that. What would it look like for each of us to be able to bring our full humanity into the workplace and for it to be honored? I mean, that's what your work is helping folks do, and it means the world. We know that you have a new book that you're working on. I don't know if you're able to talk about it much yet, so we can maybe, if we have to cut the recording, we can. But I'm curious if you are able to share. We would love for the Catalyst community to know what you are up to next.
Well, thank you so much, Erin. And truly, I know that as we continue to manifest this together, like this work really takes intention, and it's not something that happens overnight. And in fact, speaking of my next book, I have been doing research into a lot of systems of oppression. And I think kind of to bring this full circle, what I realize is like the road towards like that level of justice and equity is both really long and really painful and fraught. And it feels like that, especially right now as we encounter these attacks. And as I go back and look at like throughout history, how much progress we've made, that also gives me so much of hope, right? And sometimes it's easy to forget like the history of, like being a woman in the workplace. And there was a time where like for many women, there was, there were no restrooms, or like you were called honey and sweetie all the time, and there was just no recourse. And I always say like there is progress. It feels really slow and the road ahead is so long. But when you look back, you also, we have to take stock of the gains we've made. And so my next book is called Uncompete. And it's really about dismantling the sort of competition mindset that I think most of us in a capitalist society have really been conditioned with, right? Like this idea, like zero-sum thinking, sharp elbows out. I certainly look at the history of like the queen bee myth and the queen bee syndrome of like this woman in leadership who, is really dominating, has no, doesn't believe in the sisterhood, and making sure that other people and other women rise with them can often be harder on women that they manage and work with than the men they manage and work with. So, looking at all of that and saying like, hey, we need a different way. We need a workplace culture and society where we collaborate, where we let go of the scarcity mindset and truly believe in and practice abundance. And more than anything, a philosophy and way of life where we stop approaching everything with competition. And again, it takes intention, right? Because from grade school, from kindergarten, we have been conditioned to like compete for the grade, compete for like the person who ran the fastest, to, all throughout school, all throughout our academic career, and then certainly in the workplace and in society. And for me, so much of this is like, if we are truly going to rise, if we're truly going to create this future where everyone wins, we need to stop believing and stop only focusing on the gains that we can make as individuals or just our own community.
Oh my gosh, I can't wait to read your book.
Thank you.
Like such a paradigm shift for the way we think about not only the workplace, but I mean society overall, right? And I can think of times even in what I would consider fairly inclusive workspaces, being told by bosses like, oh, watch out for her kind of thing. And thinking, 20 years ago, that doesn't seem right to me. It's certainly at odds with my own personal ethos and, empathy, thinking that doesn't ring true to me, but that's what is expected in order to, climb the ranks. So we so need your insight on this and excited to read your book.
Thank you. I mean, for me, I'd say so much of this new, I think, really forward looking is to say like a lot of what we were conditioned with, a lot of the norms we were told about the workplace, about society don't hold true anymore. It's so interesting. Like just to end on this anecdote, this morning, my 7-year-old was like, Mom, what's smoking? Right. And I was like explaining to him like smoking. And then he's like, yeah, but like, you're not allowed to smoke in restaurants and you're not allowed to, like, there's these signs everywhere where it says, can't smoke 150 feet, whatever it is. And I was like, well, when I grew up and certainly growing up in Singapore, like there were restaurants you could smoke inside. There were like, you could smoke right outside the airport, like sometimes even inside. There were smoking rooms in which there still are. And so it's like, just because we've done things a certain way, now that we know better, we don't have to continue in that way, right? And I always say that it's this idea like, oh, but like we can't change old habits. And for me, I say no, we absolutely can. Whether it's inclusion, whether it's competition, whether it's creating a more abundant and a society where again everyone can thrive. The opportunity is there, but we have to imagine it.
I love that. It makes me think of what Ashley Ford, the author, often says, which is, just because something is common does not make it normal. And there's so many behaviors or, things that we've kind of normalized in a workplace just because they're common. But I love that you're encouraging us to rethink that. Say, well, no. What if we replace those norms and common things with something that look different? So excited to read the book. And I have one final question. I know we're probably over time, but we, in honor of the title of this podcast, which is, it's named after Catalyst founder Felice Schwartz, one of her books, Breaking with Tradition. Can you think of a time where you broke with tradition?
I mean, I think everything in my life, honestly, is about breaking with tradition. The reason what drew me to Catalyst's work more than a decade ago, especially when I was a full-time business journalist, so even 2 decades ago, was the reality that, I had not seen women who looked like me, who worked outside the home, who were allowed to, in our culture, in our society, especially pursue corporate careers, ones where they could really name and live up to their ambition. And so for me, I always think to myself, like, how did I get so lucky? I live this dream that like, I can choose what I want to do. I can choose how to spend my time. I can have agency over my money, over my body. I mean, what a gift and what a way to break with tradition. Of course, it comes with fears and questions and, which I've certainly have many of, but I feel so lucky to break with tradition this way.
It's amazing. Well, we're grateful that you are. It's really helping so many other people do the same thing and see that, what's possible not only for us, but for the workplace and sort of our overall collective being. So
thank you so much, Erin, and thank you to you and thank you to Catalyst for all you do. It means a lot to make seen and make heard a lot of what we've had to keep unseen and unheard and keep silenced for so long. So thank you.
Oh, likewise. It means a lot.
If you like what you heard today, be sure to subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen, watch on YouTube, or find us on catalyst.org/podcast.